Hello, everybody. We are going to have a quick, hopefully 15-minute video on conflict management. The reason for doing that is twofold. Number one, a conflict management discussion is absolutely relevant for any organizational behavior course because it relates to how well we handle interpersonal differences in the workplace and in your personal life. Secondarily, I wanted to do this now at this particular time, because as you know, we've been working on getting you to thinking about building high-performing teams and actually having you apply that knowledge to your team, particularly because you're going to be building a business this semester. So what better time than to get your high-performing team to think about how you're going to manage conflict throughout the semester. So there are 3 topics: you and conflict handling styles, and biases that get in our way. So I'm going to start with you and conflict. And the reason for this is simply to get you to reflect about how you handle conflict, what your strengths are, and what your weaknesses are. And we will talk a bit more about these in class. So first, some questions. What do you like in a fight? And I use that term fight, I think, because it evokes a lot of situations for us, but you may not see the word fight as the appropriate word depending on how you view conflict. But I say, what do you like in a fight? Verbal fight, not a physical fight. What's your general mindset? What are the things that go through your mind or thoughts, and what are the implications of these? And what are the assumptions that you make about the other party and even potentially yourself? And what are the implications of those assumptions? Second, what are some key strengths or a key strength that you have in managing conflict and a key weakness? And I put the term negotiation in here because I wanted to remind you that negotiation is one of the key ways that we actually solve conflict. A few others being communication, mediation, and it could become a physical altercation, obviously, would be other ways of handling conflict. But I wanted you to get thinking about you in negotiation. What I would recommend you do now is actually pause the video for a few minutes and take some notes about this stuff, because it's really important. We know from studies that the only real chance that we have of changing the way that we handle conflict is to actually sit down and really reflect upon it, and then try and behave differently, try and look for role models who can help us think about implementing different styles and tactics, and also taking classes, for example, on handling conflict, and reading books can actually help us as well. But in this case, I simply want you to become more self-aware about yourself so you can see what you're like when you face conflict this semester. Okay, now conflict handling styles. The 5 styles, you should have already taken your conflict handling style self-assessment. This is a traditional X and Y axes layout of the 5 styles so that you can see this. What you can't see down here, and I'm sorry, the screen apparently cut it off, on the X-axis is cooperativeness. The term cooperativeness will be down here. On the y-axis is assertiveness. The x-axis speaks to the degree to which we cooperate with the other person. If we're on the low end of cooperation, then obviously we're not trying to look out for the other party's interests. But if we're on the high end of cooperation toward the right-hand side of the axis, then we are really trying to cooperate with the other party. The same goes here. The assertiveness goes from low to high. If we're on the low end of assertiveness, we're really not thinking about our own needs at all. We're just potentially avoiding them, for example. On the high end of assertiveness, we really are working to say, here are my interests, and trying to think about how you can meet those interests. So once you put the X and Y axes together, you have your 5 styles. If you are not cooperative with the other party and you're not assertive with your own needs, you are effectively avoiding conflict. Now, to be sure, that actually can be a reasonable style occasionally to use. For example, if you and somebody else in the workplace or in your personal life have experienced a moment of frustration with each other and it's over something very insignificant, you may well just choose to avoid it, in which case, again, you're not trying to be cooperative to meet their needs and yours. You're just letting it go. On the right-hand side, over here is when you're very cooperative with the other party, but you're low on assertiveness of your own needs. And that's essentially accommodating, or what we call yielding. And you can see this person with his or her head down, meaning a lot of the time we end up being accommodating. We end up feeling rejected or resentful because we've just given in to the other party without thinking about trying to help ourselves in the process. Compromising is probably the most commonly used one that you would think about, where you give a little bit and you get a little bit. You essentially what it's called log roll, where you get some of what you want and give up some of what you want. Competing is when, or what's alternatively called forcing, is when you're very, very assertive of your own needs, but you're not cooperating with the other party. And that would be, effectively if you tend to be somebody who just yells and screams and says it's my way or the highway, or this is the way we're going to do things, and you really never inquire about what the other party wants and try to work with that. Collaborating is when you're both highly cooperative and assertive of your own needs. This is also called problem solving. And if you could imagine, there are two styles across situations that tend to be more effective in use. And not surprisingly, those would be compromising and collaborating. The three that can pose problems are these three. Accommodating often leaves people feeling resentful, rejected, like they don't work for themselves and their interests. Avoiding can get really in our way because it starts to build. You just let something go with another person and then it ultimately escalates. And competing is obviously can be met with anger and frustration on the part of other parties you're dealing with when you don't look out for their interests and they start to want to disengage with you. Now, the other thing is, in terms of conflict handling styles, I put this picture of a mom and her son on here to make you think about the fact that the way that you handle conflict, that is the scores that you got on those 5 styles, is usually strongly correlated with how you were raised. That is, how you interacted with a caregiver or caregivers in your life. So what typically happens is we tend to either use those people as role models or anti-role models. If your parent tended to be a problem solver, you may well have seen that and started to pick up on a lot of that. Whereas on the flip side, if somebody tended to be heavily competing or forcing, you may like fighting, arguing, yelling, not giving in. You may well have mirrored that in your own life. So in order to think about changing and improving, you got to figure out, well, where did I even get this from? Because so often in life we're on autopilot. Okay, now I will try to move through these quickly to get them into one video, but let me work through this in brief. Here's obviously the mindset. The mindset is a big player in conflict management. Now, the key is that we start with observable data in our environment. So I'm going to give you an example here because it's going to play into the rest of the video. If you are in a performance evaluation and you're the supervisor and giving a performance evaluation for someone, what's around you in that room, the chair, the table, what he or she's wearing, what you're wearing, everything that's observable is there. Now, what happens in our mind is we select data now that we choose to observe. In this case, what I want you to pay attention to is the fact that he's looking out the window. So there's the data, and you see it, and then you start to add meaning to that. And we'll say in the United States, when people aren't looking at you, often there's a tendency to add the meaning and, in addition, assumptions that you can probably hear my daughter in the background. Add meanings and assumptions that person is not paying attention to you. So here you are in a performance evaluation and that person is not paying attention to you. Now, what you do with that is you say, okay, I start to make assumptions. She's not paying attention to me. And wow, I think that, he is not paying attention to me. And you know what? I don't think he's very interested in his job. I don't think he likes me, which are clearly assumptions. You don't know this. And then you draw conclusions. Well, he or she's not very interested in the job, and therefore I don't know that I really want to work with this person anymore. and I'm not going to give this person key assignments. This person is very lazy. Then you could take that a step further, and once we have a few of these or many of these observations, we start to adopt beliefs about the world. So it could be, you have some of these moments, and so you start to say, if you think about these and you start to draw generalized conclusions, you start to say, people in life are lazy. They're not going to do what you want them to do. And that very heavily, your mindset that is, influences the actions that you take. Because in this case, your tendencies say you could end up not giving this person any choice assignments anymore. You might not spend much time with the person. You may not give good feedback anymore. You may tell that person, I don't think you're very engaged in work. And this becomes a huge problem. Because it can become a vicious cycle wherein if you're interacting with this gentleman and you start to treat him as though he's lazy and you don't give him choice assignments, you don't interact with him, you don't give him good feedback, he will start to respond to you. So he might say, you know what, my supervisor doesn't like me and is not trying to help me out in my career, so I'm not going to try anymore. And I'm actually going to go out of my way to be less than proactive in the workplace. And all of a sudden, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and you say, I knew that about him, and it becomes ugly. So what I'm going to do now is talk to you, and we'll continue with this in class in brief, but I want to get you to think about traditional conflict handling biases that we all face, and this is a problem across the board. Here are 5. And the first, I'm going to start down here with 5, avoid upsetting situations. We all tend to avoid conflict when we shouldn't. And sometimes, again, we should, but most of the time we shouldn't. So that's number 5, and that's an important one because you have to think in a moment when you feel conflict with somebody and you don't address it, you have effectively avoided it. And you just have to figure out for yourself, should I have done that or not? Number 1 is that we assume we're right. We go into any conflict most of the time thinking, I am right. And secondarily, I am more reasonable than that other party. And then you take it a step further by saying, if I just talk enough in a reasonable manner, the other person will come around to see my side of the world. It's called naive realism, where we think that we have a hold on some truth about the world, this invariant truth, and it's objective, versus realizing that there's, the key is that whether there's an objective reality from a philosophical standpoint doesn't matter. The reality is that everybody comes from their own perspective and their mindset that we just spoke about. So we tend to believe we should just make a bunch of arguments and they'll come around. And then when they don't, number 3, we start to assign negative attributes and motives to them. So you get into an argument and you try to tell them what the right way of thinking is. They don't. And so all of a sudden you make attributions like, this person just isn't very nice, or they don't care very much about their job or this company, or they're very unreasonable, or all sorts of labels that we can give people. We hold others excessively accountable. So when somebody does something to us or something that harms us in some way, we tend to think that, number 1, they meant to do it. And number 2, they meant to harm us in the process, versus realizing that most people actually are not out to harm us. They're just trying to act in their own self-interest, and we may be a casualty of that. But if you start to assume that others are not trying to hurt you, but they just may have, that makes a difference. Because the minute we assume intent, and the intent is to harm, it can be very ugly. Now, lastly, I'll jump down to number 6. We engage in what's called confirmatory bias. So, for example, if you're in a conflict with somebody who you've had trouble with in the past and you don't seem to get along very well, you will tend to seek out data in your interactions that confirm what you already believe about that person. So it could be, you think somebody's lazy, the person who wasn't paying attention during the performance evaluation. You will look for evidence that, in fact, that person is lazy. And when you see contradictory evidence, you will actually tend to ignore that. Now, I'm at 14 and a half minutes, and I want to keep this to one video, so I'm going to stop, but I want you to think about all this, and then we're going to talk about an alternative mindset that addresses all of these biases if you really work hard to pursue a different mindset. I'll see you on Monday.